The Black Dahlia, An Unsolved Murder by Aubrey Lux. Warning: viewer discretion is advised. Elizabeth Short, aka Betty or Beth, even more likely the Black Dahlia, lived in Boston for most of her youth years. However, she often visited Florida during the winter due to her weak respiratory system. Cleo Short, Elizabeth's father, disappeared in 1930 and was presumed dead. Many say it was a possible suicide by finding his car near a bridge, until 1 decade later he sent a letter to his family. Phoebe Short, Elizabeth's mother, raised 5 children alone. She and the other 4 siblings never forgave Cleo for what he did to their family, but Elizabeth did. At the age of 19, Elizabeth decided to live with her father in California, but moved to Los Angeles during World War II. After a while, Elizabeth and her father's relationship got roughed and she decided to leave home and be on her own from that time on. Elizabeth moved to many places such as California, Florida, Boston, and Los Angeles during this time. After moving around a lot, Short finally settled in California in June 1946 with the admiration for Hollywood. Short auditioned for many roles, but none ever turned out well. This never stopped Short, though. She would continue to sneak into studios to find any possible work to get her attention. Then things began to get odd. Elizabeth Short fell in love. However, no one ever met this supposed man. His name was Lieutenant Matthew Gordon and was in the Air Force, but in the summer, Gordon's plane was shot down and he didn't make it out. This is when people started questioning things like, why had no one ever met this mysterious man? And was Lieutenant Gordon even real? Short never managed to keep neither a job or a home for very long. She tended to never cooperate with bosses and never had the money to pay off rent. Elizabeth was often considered very pretty and a prowler. She lurked around many fancy Hollywood dinners or parties wearing her usual casual black dress. While Short was a prowler, she ended up meeting many shady men who tended to flirt with her. At this time, Short was technically homeless, until she decided to move to San Diego, where she slept in a Pacific Beach theater. A worker at the theater, Dorothy French, found Elizabeth and offered her a place to stay. While Elizabeth stayed here, she often told many stories and lies about how her military husband was dead, but her mother was extremely sick, so she had to send the check to her instead of keeping the money. Neither of these happened to be true. A month later, the rent was due yet again. Since Short couldn't pay up, she had to move back to LA for one more time. While in LA, Elizabeth began to go on dates with a man named Robert Red Manley, a salesman with a pregnant wife at home. As things progressed, the two traveled to a small motel on January 8, 1947. The next day, they arrived at the Biltmore Hotel. Elizabeth told Red that she was waiting for her sister to arrive at the hotel, which was taking a very long time. Red had a very important meeting to catch in which she had to leave while she was making some phone calls. This was the last moment Red ever saw Elizabeth Short alive. Red was the original prime suspect and the first person to be questioned about the murder. Red admitted that him and Short never actually dated, and them hanging out was only a test to see if he still loved his wife. Red also happened to identify one missing shoe in Short's purse that she had the night of the Biltmore Hotel. Those were located in a trash can near the murder scene. Red ended up being ruled out by passing both a polygraph and sodium pentothal test. The polygraph test is your traditional lie detector, while the sodium pentothal test is a chemical which slows the brain from receiving signals from the spinal cord. This makes it difficult to concentrate and create lies. After Red was ruled out as the murderer, he continued to go home to his wife. But a few months later, he went crazy and she had to send him to a mental hospital. Harold Stotham, the Biltmore Hotel bell captain, was the last person to see Elizabeth Short alive. Stoltham stated that Short decided to go for a walk that night instead of taking her usual cab. Short left the hotel around 10 o'clock and was seen walking down Olive Street. If she would have continued to walk 2 more blocks down that street, she would have reached Dr. George Huddle's medical office, which we'll talk about later. Stoltham's last comment was that he witnessed a man wave to Short before she continued to walk down the street. 1 week after Stoltham and Short's conversation, Elizabeth was found dead by Betty Bersinger in the weeds of an empty apartment lot. On the morning of January 15, 1947, Betty Bersinger and her daughter were walking near the local shopping center when Betty saw something strange. She never went too close to the scene, but she said that it looked like a separated mannequin because it was so white. Betty then walked down to some nearby houses and asked a lady if she could borrow her phone to call the police. When Elizabeth Short's body was found, her body was cut in half at the waist, positioned with her legs spread and hands behind her back. Her nipples were cut off, thighs and chest were partially skinned, mouth was slit from ear to ear, intestines were tucked behind her back, and her body was drained of all remaining blood. She was also freshly scrubbed along with her hair being clean. After the autopsy, it was discovered that her missing thigh tattoo of a rose was pushed inside her genitals and that all of her reproductive organs were missing. It was also found that the cuts and removal of Short's body were done after she died. The cause of death ended up being blunt force trauma to the head and shock. The reporters connected with Elizabeth Short's case were causing problems with Phoebe Short, her mother, and also starting false accusations about Elizabeth. To start with Phoebe, they had originally told her that her daughter had just won a beauty contest, and they were trying to get information about her. Finally, they told her the truth about how her daughter was murdered. After telling her, the police shut Phoebe out to keep the murder a secret. About the accusations, the reporters often said that Elizabeth never wore many clothes, that she was a prostitute, a lesbian, and a Hollywood star. All of these happened to be false. After time, more rumors and inappropriate jokes began to spread. The reporters were also the ones who had the name Black Dahlia stick for today's times. The way Elizabeth Short's body was left is all that was ever known about her murder. However, there are many conspiracies and possible suspects. As seen below, Steve Hoddle was the prime investigator, George Hoddle was the possible killer, and Cleo Short was just a conspiracy. To start with the for sure rule out, some believe Elizabeth's father, Cleo Short, murdered her. A woman wanted police to dig up Short's childhood home due to her thinking they would find weapons or remains of other victims. This was of course not true, and nothing tied Cleo to killing Elizabeth. Army Corporal Joseph Duvay was the first to confess to murdering Elizabeth. These two drank together one night in which Joseph blacked out for multiple days and woke up with no memory. Joseph was later found to be 3,000 miles away at a military base on the night of the murder and the week of. However, he remained confessing for years. Medical examiner James Richardson received a phone call with the strange confession. The caller said he had belongings of Short that he had sent over, but hung up before being able to track the call. Richardson did get a package which had Elizabeth's ID, passport, and letters that contained no evidence of who the killer was or fingerprints. After this, more than 60 men and women confessed to a crime they didn't commit. Retired LAPD and private investigator Steve Hoddle is convinced he knows who the killer is. His father, Dr. George Hoddle, is his one and only suspect. George was said to be a genius and a great surgeon, but had a dark side and rooms no one was ever allowed to go in. He was also convicted of being a molester. George's house was also bugged to hear conversations about Elizabeth and even another possible murder. However, all the tapes went missing. Everything besides this one.
Suppose I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead.
Later, Steve went through George's things after his death and found letters, news reports, and photos with Short. Steve also knew that the way the body of Elizabeth Short was handled, that medical knowledge had to be acquired by the killer, which his father did indeed have. His father's house was also searched and the dirt was sent in for examining. The results came back positive for human remains. There was so much evidence placed on George Hoddle, but it was never enough to say it was him. Adding the fact that the letters Steve found turned out not to be his father's handwriting, and the photos he found ended up not being Elizabeth, only a look-alike. Steve was and still is convinced his father is the killer of Elizabeth Short and even wrote a book about it. Not only does Steve believe George Hoddle killed Short, but he thinks his father could be the Zodiac killer and the murderer of many other women. Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia, has always had her eyes on becoming a star. Short is now a major part of Los Angeles history and is talked about by tons of people. She got the fame she was always striving towards, just not the way she was expecting. Elizabeth Short, July 29, 1924 to January 15, 1947.